Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's program of Liberty Observatory, the podcast where all things from the perspective of liberty. I speak on a number of issues, a number of areas of topics and discussion, but I always have an eye on liberty. So if you are a liberty loving individual or aspire to be one, I suggest that you like, subscribe, and share Liberty Observatory. So today we're going to take a little bit of a political bent. And the title of today's session is, Which is Better, to Speak Out or Be Silent? So which is better, to speak out or to be silent? Now we can refer the history here and draw a certain amount of conclusions. And we'll first draw back to 1930s Germany. Of course, we're going to talk about the rise of the Nazis. Nobody can talk about political history without throwing in the Nazis. It seems like it's the one political area of discussion that there's a great deal of agreement and a great deal of understanding, because everyone, right, left, and center politically, draws conclusions from the Nazis, primarily what to avoid as a society. Well, first of all, the majority of Germans most likely were not Nazis. And so, there's this misconception out here that that all the Germans were Nazis. I don't even think a majority of the Germans were Nazis. It's just that the Nazis became such a dominating force in German society in the 1930s and 1940s that everything else paled in comparison to the rise of the Nazis. So in 1933, Adolf Hitler, in a political move, and I don't even think it was an illegal political move, he was appointed the chancellor. And I think that was by Hindenburg. And so it was a very difficult time in Germany. And the depression that we refer to in America was actually a worldwide depression. So 1930s depression hit everybody, everywhere. In fact, there are some film of 1930s Germany during the heart of the Depression where people would literally carry around or push around wheelbarrows full of marks. Marks is their version of the dollar. And so there was hyperinflation, and whenever you have an unstable, highly inflated economy, there's a lot of stress and put upon that society. And that's exactly what Germany was experiencing at the time, but I'm not offering that as an excuse. I'm offering it as to help develop an understanding of what led to the rise of the Nazis. Furthermore, you can say that, well, the majority of Germans were not Nazis, but a majority of Germans were anti-communist. The Soviet Union was to the east of them, and expansionist world communist point of view. And the German people really, as a whole, did not have any interest in having a communist country in Germany. And so, but you had your activists. You had your activists on the right, the Nazis, the National Socialists, which is interesting. They incorporated the word socialist in their name. And then you had the communists. And so they would battle in the streets. and not a whole lot different than some of the battles we're seeing in the streets now in America. So the Nazis and the communists would fight it out in the streets, and by default, a lot of people sided with the Nazis. Not because they were Nazis, because they were so anti-communist that they wanted the Nazis to win the street battles. They didn't want the communists to win the street battles and ultimately live in a country that had to deal with the worldwide growth of communism at the time. And so, the rest is history, so to speak. But what's really interesting is at what level the Nazis destroyed lives. They destroyed lives, right, left, and center, regardless of ethnicity, national origin, etc. And yet, many of the German soldiers were captivated by Nazism, even though many of them were not Nazis. On YouTube, you can go and see some video of German soldiers. Germans kept good records. They kept good diaries. And the communists, I guess they wanted to learn all they could about the German soldiers. When they killed a German soldier, if they had a diary, they would lift it. And that diary would be sent back to Moscow and then cataloged or whatever. And then a few years ago, Russia released those diaries. And the diaries are very, very revealing. Unfortunately, on the West, the Allied side, they weren't lifting diaries, apparently, because there's not many diaries that the Allies took from dead German soldiers on the Western Front. So anyhow, this was a fairly common occurrence. And it was probably, in my view, one of the worst battles of all time, and that's the Battle of Stalingrad. The reason it was so terrible is that it was in Russia, and the Russian winter is brutal. And during the course of this battle, the Germans actually were in Stalingrad, at least in the suburbs, and the Russian army surrounded them. So they surrounded the Germans inside of Stalingrad, and then they cut off the supplies. The middle of winter. And the Battle of Stalingrad largely is the Germans trying to break out of the encirclement by the Soviets. In other words, they wanted to flee to the east. Well, anyhow, some of these German soldiers that had diaries, they were bleak. They were miserable, and indeed they were, because, it's sub-zero weather a lot of time, and it wasn't like you could, just crawl under a blanket in a nice, comfortable place. You dug trenches, and frozen ground digging trenches, good luck with that. And so basically everything was hard and everything was miserable, and they were encircled by the Soviets. But part of the problem with the Nazi ideal is that in some of these diaries, the German soldiers would still aspire, because of their nationalistic instincts, to fight for the fatherland. And it was kind of like, how can you love Adolf Hitler, mein Führer? How can you love him when he sent you into a situation where you were surely to die and be miserable until you died in the Battle of Stalingrad? I'll never understand how some people can't think enough into a process where who got you where you're at. If you got you where you're at, then take responsibility for it and do what you can to get out of. But a lot of people wind up in terrible situations because of somebody else's frustration and ugliness and pipe dream, false sense of what should be done in the world and how it should be led. So these poor German soldiers, because of their love for the fatherland, their nationalism, these poor German soldiers on the one hand would talk about the bleakness on the Eastern Front, and on the other hand have great pride that they were German soldiers, and not seem to connect that the Nazis got them on the Eastern Front freezing to death and being shot at by tons of military hardware with the Soviet army. So, 1930s Germany. Now let's go back to the 1930s and 1940s and talk about Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. Now he was actually in some form of leadership or other from the 1920s to the 1950s, but his rise to power was in the 1930s and 1940s. And he consolidated power during that period. And he was ruthless, absolutely ruthless. There's a book by Solzhenitsyn called Gulag Archipelago, and he pointed out a few things in his book that, and he was Soviet. He was Russian. He would never probably call himself a Soviet because he wasn't a communist. And that's why he wound up in a gulag, because he was a free-thinking, free-minded type person who never bought into the communist line. But anyhow, he knew enough about it as to what was going on and the tyranny associated with Joseph Stalin. For instance, you have these big assembly halls, and the communists would be gathered together. They'd wait for Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin would show up, and they'd all clap. They'd all clap when Joseph Stalin arrived and took the podium. And so, according to Solzhenitsyn, the clapping would be really long, like 40, 45 minutes. And what happened is that all these good Soviet communists sitting in this assembly hall would be looking around because nobody wanted to be the first person to stop clapping, because that would be construed as disloyal to Stalin and Soviet communism. And so here you are, you're a communist, you want to please the communist system, you want to show how dedicated you are, and you're clapping when Joseph Stalin enters the room and you're afraid to stop. There's something wrong with that. Another thing, Joseph Stalin executed a lot of communists. As he garnered power for himself, he had to make sure that all his perceived threats were eliminated. And so we had a situation where he was executing communists right and left. And it was fairly common that the communists who were being executed would apologize. They were dedicated, wholly committed communists who believed in everything that communism represented or could be. And yet, at the end of the day, they'd apologize for being executed by Stalin's troops or Stalin's henchmen. And so here we have a situation where dedicated communists would apologize. Another example of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, and that's the Ukrainian mass starvation. I have seen figures as high as 20 million. I have a hard time believing it was 20 million. But what happened is that Joseph Stalin, Ukraine apparently is fruitful. Apparently you can grow crops in Ukraine. But what he did was he would take the crops, take the the grain or whatever that was produced, loaded into freight cars, and then headed back towards Russia, to Moscow or wherever in Russia. And so the Ukrainian people were left starving because everything that they produced got on a train and headed east. And there's a movie out there called Mr. Jones where this is diagnosed or analyzed. And so no wonder the Ukrainian people do not like the Russians very much. And no wonder they're offering such a valiant resistance to the Russian army, because they know what it is to be oppressed by the Russians. And, it's kind of like Vladimir Putin is a modern day Soviet, even though he's not called a Soviet, he's not called a communist, he's called an oligarch, which means that there is a tremendous growth of tyrants in mostly major favors, corruption. You got extremely wealthy people in Russia, and then you got extremely poor people in Russia, and that makes a very bad dynamic. So terrible, terrible environment in the Soviet Union, terrible, terrible environment in Nazi Germany. But it's not limited to that. Let's take a look at the Mexican cartels. And I've been reading a book that talks about life in San Fernando, Mexico, south of the Texan border. And back in the 70s, they had what was called the Gulf Cartel. And they were actually kind of paternalistic, I think. They did regular type of smuggling, maybe sombreros or whatever. They just did ordinary type of smuggling, and they were not tyrannical. Well, then later, getting back to about the 1990s, there was a group called the Zetas, Z-E-T-A, another cartel, and they were ruthless. They tended to be former military men, so they were highly trained, and they were killers. They were ruthless. And so they pushed the Gulf cartel out of San Fernando as well as other parts of Mexico. And their big stock in trade was drugs, but they have ancillary things going on as well, and that included kidnapping and holding people for ransom. And so you had a situation where people would disappear, that'd be, taken off the streets, that'd be held by the Zetas. The Zetas would contact the family and, extort them for money, and maybe the people could pay, maybe they couldn't pay, and maybe people could get their children back or their family member back, and maybe they could not. Maybe even after paying, the kidnapped person was killed. So the Zetas were ruthless, and they're still around today. But things didn't really start turning around versus the Zetas until they sent the Mexican army in. See, before the Mexican army, and even after the Mexican army, because Mexican army has its own issues with corruption, is that the lifestyle in San Fernando was that you don't go out in the evening, you get your kids out of the city. In other words, if they can go live with other family members, if you could flee into the USA or some other part of Mexico. So they were literally, the Zetas were literally strangling the life out of San Fernando. And then they brought in the Mexican military. And they had the equipment, the supplies, the men, the arms, and they had battles with Zeta. And the Mexican army won, and then promptly they executed a bunch of people. And so just think about that in America. You have a cartel take over your city, you're afraid to do anything, you don't want to go out at night, you want to mind your own business, they have Zeta checkpoints, and you want to make sure that you don't do anything to inflame anybody at the checkpoint. And then in order to quell or quench the cartel, the army comes in. So you got to bring in the U.S. Army to fight on the streets of your city to fight the cartel. This is some of what our Mexican friends have to deal with. And like I said, the Mexican army sometimes isn't a whole lot better than the cartels because they go in and kill a bunch of people as well. So what am I driving at? I'm driving at this question of which is better, to speak out or be silent. So we're really talking about what I call the rule of synergism. And if you think in terms of like a leaning tree in the woods that's rotting, it's going to be very, very slow leaning. There may be years go by that all it does is lean. But at some point, it's going to reach a certain synergistic level where the tree is going to fall. And it's going to start off slowly falling. And then it's going to fall really hard. And it's going to hit the ground really hard. So that's kind of how societies work. This rule of synergism relates to multiplicity rather than arithmetic. In other words, you can have small incremental gains or losses in a society, but synergy leads to rapid changes, sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. There is no moral compass associated with societal synergy. It can be good or bad. I'll give you a couple examples of good. You go back to the early 1500s, the Italian Renaissance. Did you know that Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo actually knew each other? The Renaissance is noted for this explosion of beautiful art and development and creativity in Italy and all across Southern Europe that eventually bled into Northern Europe and other parts of the world. And so you have this beautiful artwork come out of that period. You have the Sistine Chapel, painting of the ceiling. You have Michelangelo's David. You have Da Vinci's Last Supper. And you have all these inventions that Da Vinci conjured up in his mind and made blueprints for. And so that's just two. There is a whole lot of creativity that happened in a very short time. And this was something where the people, those that had artistic talent at a significant level, they were feeding off of each other. And it's synergized. In other words, the development in the Renaissance of art and other modern ways of expressing or doing things exploded during the Renaissance. Let me give you another example. If you go back to like 1900 or late 1800s, and Albert Einstein was born in Germany. And within about 50 miles, 75 miles of where he was born, there were 4 or 5 other genius mathematicians. So Einstein was a genius, obviously. He was a theorist. He was a mathematician. And basically, he did miraculous work primarily with his theory of relativity. And so basically, there was synergy. You had these other mathematical geniuses who were alive and relating to at the time where they fed off of each other. Would we have had the theory of relativity if Einstein was alone in a petri dish for nothing to feed off of? Probably not. Same way for the great artwork of the Renaissance. Would we have Michelangelo's David unless there was other artists around to inspire and learn from? Probably not. So synergism can be very, very positive, and it's like the leaning tree. It's slowly but surely, but it reaches a certain point, and then it falls rapidly and hits hard. So, when you talk about the failures of society, it is better to speak out, first and foremost, before the tree dies. But if the tree is dying and leaning, speak out before it starts falling, because you don't want to be hit by the falling tree. In other words, the Nazis had to be repudiated early on in the early 1930s. They had to be discredited at that time before the whole thing got rolling, where the power associated with the Nazis synergized and caused that society to fail as the falling tree went faster and faster until it hit hard. So it's better to speak out early in the process, because the tendency, once that tree starts falling, is to step aside. In other words, you are being silenced because you're afraid of the ramifications of what you're saying. And that's what tyrants capitalize on: the silence of the majority. You don't say anything. Good German people let the Night of Kristallnacht occur. And that's when the Nazis went in and destroyed a lot of Jewish businesses in Germany. Speak out early. The same way with the Soviets. Speak out early. The Soviets could have been defeated by the people before the tree started falling by speaking out. Same way with the cartels. Speak out early. Oppose it early before it gains synergistic force, where you've got a falling tree and the only thing you think you can do is just stand aside. And that's what happened in San Fernando. The poor people of San Fernando wouldn't even go out. They stopped going out. I guess they did go out during the day, but at night they stopped going out. And then they shipped their kids off to another city. Speak out early. So here is an exhortation for free speech. Be a huge advocate of free speech, because if you're afraid to speak out and you're concerned about the ramifications of speaking out, the tree is starting to fall. You should have a robust free speech where you can express your opinion and keep that tree from falling. Even if it's rotting, you don't want it to fall, because you never know what the replacement is can be. You never know what the next Nazi regime is going to be like, or the next Soviet regime is going to be like, or the next cartel is going to be like. And I'm not suggesting that we should accept bad society, but we have to concern ourselves with a society that's ruled by tyrants that don't care about people and that only think of themselves. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. Speak out early. Be an advocate of free speech, not just for yourself, but for your neighbor. Adios, goodbye.